In 1983, a BBC interviewer sat down across from me and asked a question that sounds simple. He said, "Can you explain to me why magnets attract each other?" And I want you to watch what happened next, because what happened next reveals something most people never think about. I refused to answer the question, not because I didn't know the physics. I knew the physics better than almost anyone alive at the time. I refused because the question itself was broken. And once I show you why, you are going to realize that almost everything you think you understand about magnets, about forces, about explanation itself, is built on a foundation that does not exist. You think you know what a magnet is. Of course you do. You've played with them since you were a child. You've stuck them to refrigerators. You've felt two of them snap together from inches apart or push against each other no matter how hard you try to force them together. You know that opposite poles attract and like poles repel. You learned this in school. It's simple. It's obvious. It's not even worth a second thought. Except it is. Because here's the question nobody actually answers. Why? In 1983, a BBC interviewer sat down across from me and asked a question that sounds simple. He said, "Can you explain to me why magnets attract each other?" And I want you to watch what happened next, because what happened next reveals something most people never think about. I refused to answer the question, not because I didn't know the physics. I knew the physics better than almost anyone alive at the time. I refused because the question itself was broken. And once I show you why, you are going to realize that almost everything you think you understand about magnets, about forces, about explanation itself, is built on a foundation that does not exist. You think you know what a magnet is. Of course you do. You've played with them since you were a child. You've stuck them to refrigerators. You felt two of them snap together from inches apart or push against each other no matter how hard you try to force them together. You know that opposite poles attract and like poles repel. You learned this in school. It's simple. It's obvious. It's not even worth a second thought. Except it is. Because here's the question nobody actually answers. Why? Why does a magnet attract another piece of metal? What is actually happening in the space between them? What is reaching across that gap and pulling? When the interviewer asked me this question, I told him I couldn't answer it in the way he wanted, and he pushed back. He said something like, "Everybody else would just tell me it's because of the magnetic field, or magnetism, the magnetic force between the magnets." And I said, "That's not an explanation. That's just giving the phenomenon a name and pretending you've explained it. If I tell you magnets attract because of magnetic force, what have I actually told you? Nothing. I've just labeled the mystery. I've replaced the question, why does this happen, with a word, force, and then acted like the question is answered, but it isn't. You still don't know what's actually happening. You just have a name for your ignorance now instead of an explanation." This is the trap almost everyone falls into when they think about science. They mistake naming something for understanding it. They think if a phenomenon has a label, a category, a textbook chapter, then it's been explained. It hasn't. Naming a thing and explaining a thing are completely different acts. And nowhere is this more obvious, more uncomfortable than with magnetism. Let me walk you through what I actually told that interviewer, because it's going to change how you think about explanation itself. I said, when you ask me why magnets attract, what kind of answer would satisfy you? If I tell you it's because of muscles in my arm, you'll accept that because you already have a picture in your head, a feeling of what it's like to use your muscles to pull something toward you. You understand muscle pulling because you have direct felt bodily experience of it. So when I say muscles pulled the object, your brain says, "Oh yes, I know what that feels like, explanation accepted." But the attraction between two magnets has no such everyday counterpart. There is no familiar sensation, no muscle, no rope, no rod, nothing visible connecting the two magnets that you can point to and say, that is the thing doing the pulling. You want me to explain magnetism in terms of something you already find intuitive, and here is the problem. I cannot do that. Not because I'm hiding something, not because the answer is too complicated for television. I cannot do that because there is nothing simpler than electromagnetism to explain it in terms of... Electromagnetism is one of the four fundamental forces of the universe. It is not built out of smaller, more familiar pieces. It is itself one of the basic, irreducible facts about how reality is put together. When you ask, why does the magnet pull, you are implicitly assuming that every phenomenon must be explainable in terms of some more familiar, more basic phenomenon. Push must come from contact. Pulling must come from a rope or a muscle. But nature does not owe you that comfort. At some point, if you keep asking why, you arrive at a fact that simply is the way it is, and there is nothing further underneath it to which it can be reduced. Electromagnetism is one of those facts. It is fundamental. And when something is fundamental, you cannot explain it in terms of something else because there is no something else underneath it. You can only describe how it behaves with tremendous precision and use that description to predict everything that follows from it. But you cannot make the force itself feel intuitive, because intuition is built from contact, from muscles, from springs and ropes, and electromagnetism is not made of any of that. All of that, your muscles, your ropes, your springs, is actually made of electromagnetism. You cannot explain the foundation in terms of the building built on top of it. This is the misconception almost everyone carries about magnets, and honestly about most of physics. People think science is in the business of making mysterious things familiar. It isn't. Science is in the business of finding the smallest number of fundamental rules that correctly predict everything else, even when those fundamental rules remain, at bottom, strange, unfamiliar, resistant to the kind of explanation you actually want. So if I can't explain magnetism in terms of something simpler, what can I tell you about it? Quite a lot, actually. Let me show you what's really happening, even though it will never resolve into a comfortable, familiar picture. A magnet is made of atoms, and electrons orbit those atoms, or more precisely exist around those atoms in quantum states. Electrons have a property called spin, and spin generates a tiny magnetic field, the same way moving electric charge generates a magnetic field in a wire. In most materials, the electrons pair up with opposite spins, and their tiny magnetic fields cancel out. The material as a whole has no net magnetism, but in certain materials, iron, nickel, cobalt, a significant fraction of electrons remain unpaired, and their spins, and therefore their tiny magnetic fields, can align with each other across huge numbers of atoms. When billions of these atomic magnets line up in the same direction, their tiny fields add together into one large field that extends out into the space around the material. That field is not a substance. It is not made of particles you can hold. It is a region of space where, if you place another magnetic material or moving charge, that material or charge will experience a force. The two magnets do not touch. There is no rod, no rope, no muscle. There is a field, an altered condition of space itself, generated by the aligned spins of countless electrons, and that field exerts a force on the other magnet's own field. The push or pull you feel when you bring two magnets close together is the interaction between two regions of altered space, each one shaped by the coordinated quantum behavior of electrons inside ordinary atoms. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a simplification for television. That is the actual physical mechanism, all the way down to where physics currently stops being able to go further. But notice something. I have not made magnetism feel familiar. I have described it precisely. I have told you what generates the field, how the field behaves, what equations govern it, what predictions it makes, predictions that have been tested to extraordinary precision. But I have not told you what the field actually is in terms of anything more basic, because there is nothing more basic. The field is not like a rope, because ropes are themselves held together by electromagnetic forces between atoms. The field is not like a stream of water, because water molecules are held together by electromagnetic forces. Every familiar analogy you might reach for is itself built out of the very thing you are trying to use the analogy to explain. This is the wall that all physics eventually hits. You keep asking why, and the answers get more precise, more mathematically exact, more thoroughly tested against experiment, but they never become more intuitively familiar at the deepest level. At some point you reach the brute facts about nature, the fundamental forces, the fundamental particles, the fundamental rules, and those facts are not explainable in terms of anything else. They simply are how the universe behaves. You can describe them, you can predict with them. You can build entire civilizations on top of them. But you cannot make them feel like pushing a chair or pulling a rope, because they are not that. They are something else entirely, something your evolved intuition was never built to grasp directly. And here's what I find remarkable about this, what I think most people miss entirely. This isn't a failure of physics. This isn't science admitting defeat. This is physics being honest about where explanation actually bottoms out. Most people want explanation to be an infinite regress, where you can always ask why one more time and get a satisfying answer that resolves into something cozier and more familiar. But that is not how reality is built. Reality has a floor. And when you hit that floor, the only honest thing to do is say, this is simply how it is. Here is the precise mathematical description. Here is how it behaves, and here is everything that follows from it. Pretending you've gone deeper than that, pretending you've found some familiar mechanical picture underneath the fundamental force, is not science. It's storytelling that makes you feel better without actually teaching you anything new. When the interviewer kept pushing, kept asking me to just explain it more simply, I told him I could only explain it in terms of the actual physics, electromagnetic forces, fields, electromagnetic forces, fields, the behavior of electrons, and that this is not a compromise or a cop-out. It is the deepest level of explanation that exists. There is no simpler picture hiding underneath. The simpler picture you want in terms of pushing and pulling like hands grabbing rope. That picture does not correspond to anything real at the fundamental level. It's a comforting illusion built from your daily experience of touching solid objects, objects that are themselves underneath, made of nothing but electromagnetic forces holding atoms together. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Every time you ask, why does something happen, and you receive an answer, ask yourself a further question. Has this answer actually told me something new about the mechanism, or has it simply renamed the phenomenon and disguised that renaming as an explanation? Most explanations you encounter in daily life are renamings. Why did the patient get sick? Because of a virus. What is a virus? A thing that makes people sick. That's circular. It's not wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in a way people rarely notice. Real explanation requires going further, finding the actual mechanism and being honest about where that mechanism eventually bottoms out into a fact that simply is the way nature is built. Magnetism bottoms out very quickly, more quickly than people expect, because it is one of the four fundamental forces of the universe, alongside gravity and the strong and weak nuclear forces. There is no deeper layer to electromagnetism the way there might be a deeper layer underneath, say, the explanation of why ice floats, which bottoms out eventually in the geometry of water molecules and hydrogen bonds, themselves a consequence of electromagnetic force. Magnetism is not derived from something else. It is one of the small number of basic ingredients the universe is built from. And I think that is far more remarkable than any comfortable analogy could ever be. You are not missing some secret mechanical explanation that television networks are too impatient to let me give. You are standing at the edge of what nature actually is, at the most fundamental level physics has been able to reach. And what you find there is not a familiar mechanism. It is a field, an invisible alteration of space itself, generated by the coordinated quantum spin of electrons, capable of reaching across empty distance and exerting force on other matter with absolutely nothing physically connecting the two objects involved. That is not a disappointing answer. That is the actual structure of reality, stripped of the comforting fictions we usually wrap around it. The magnet on your refrigerator is not doing something simple that we have failed to explain properly. It is doing something genuinely strange, something fundamental, something that sits at the very floor of physical explanation. And the next time someone asks you why magnets attract, you'll know the honest answer is not a story about hooks or strings or invisible hands. The honest answer is that you've reached the bottom of explanation, and at the bottom, nature simply is what it is. If you want to keep seeing the world for what it actually is, not what it appears to be, subscribe. That's what this channel is for.